time for your questions toward the end. We will also take time at the end to talk about a forthcoming extra edition of Leader Magazine that we're putting together on COVID-19, as well as some upcoming webinars. For today, we have put together an amazing panel here of pastors and caregivers and counselors from the United States and Canada to help us unpack what it means to provide care at a distance. Today we have David Augsburger, Shannon Dycus, John Dresher Lehman, Ann Kaufman Weaver, Gilberto Flores, and Wanda Wagler-Martin. We are going to center our conversation today around presence and care. How are we being present to those in our congregations or communities? And how are we experiencing the presence of God and attending to our own self-care? David Augsburger is Emeritus Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. He's the author of over 20 books on caregiving, counseling, marriage, and family, and he will lead our conversation today with our panelists. Before we start, we invite the panelists to introduce themselves and their context. As they introduce themselves, I invite you panelists to name yourselves, your location and your experience in pastoral care and counseling, and then also talk about what one moment of caregiving since sheltering in place began has been truly pastoral and touched your soul. Let's go ahead and get started with you, David.
I think, I'm David, and I think the moment that touched my soul deeply was preparing and leading in a memorial service for a tragic death, a expected but still sad death of someone within our larger fellowship here. And to discover the warmth and the connectedness and the presence of all of the people with each other. 40 people gathered in a circle around the bereaved husband. It was a moment of perhaps more intimacy than what you might have gotten in a church building.
Good afternoon. My name is Shannon Dycus. I'm the Dean of Students at Eastern Mennonite University, and it's great to be with each of you all today. A moment of care that has blessed me in this time of distance. In the world of higher education, we pretty abruptly had to depart from campuses and missed the way that we live together in community. And what we were able to do at EMU was to get on a phone and call all of our students and check in. And I was so blessed by the opportunities to not just call and check in on our students and to say, what do you need? But in almost every single conversation I had, the response back to me was, Shannon, how are you? And the act of mutual care in the midst of this time has been blessing. And so I offer that, and I'm grateful for this time.
Good afternoon. I'm John Dresher Lehman. I am a therapist and spiritual director in Southeast Pennsylvania, just north of Philly. And this is my office where I typically see clients. Now all I see here is my dog. And the piece that has touched me has not been one moment, but it's been being invited into people's houses because now I see their space. And I'm meeting their dogs and their cats. And most of the people that I work with are trauma survivors, and they often struggle to make intimate, close connections to the people in their lives, but their animals have access to them in ways that when I sit with them and I get to meet their pit bull or their cat, I'm invited into a very intimate space that then creates this mood that comes into the session that we have. And that's touched me in ways that I just did not expect to have happen.
I'm Ann Kaufman Weaver, and I am a chaplain at Landis Homes Retirement Community in Lidditz, PA. And I am able to still see the residents face to face with restrictions, with goggles and gowns and masks, but I am able to go within certain households here. So what I try to do is to connect them with their loved ones that they cannot see and facilitate some online opportunities through Zoom. And the one most special was on Mother's Day. It was a woman's birthday and Mother's Day. And her husband was living in another part of campus and they cannot see each other face to face. And her children are spread out from Virginia to Hawaii. And so I came in on Mother's Day afternoon to facilitate a Zoom call where this family of, I think it was 15 or 16 with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and dogs and cats, were able to spend an hour together. And it was so beautiful to help them connect in a meaningful way.
My name is Gilberto Flores, and I'm really glad to be part of this panel. I'm residing in Guatemala City now, after 25 years working in US, mostly working with Mennonite Church in different positions, but for many years I was, and I'm still doing pastoral ministry. One thing that touched me a lot is when I discover how long, how difficult it is for some people to have a real connection with pastoral ministry sometimes because the nature of the churches. And I want just to resume that with this phrase I received from a lady during this time of distress. She says, never before a pastor contacted me in person, directly. God bless me just for the fact that you call me and get in touch with me. That was very touching for me, and it's still touching me.
Good afternoon. I'm Wanda Wagler-Martin from Waterloo, Ontario, and I have worked in the field of mental health and well-being for 31 years now as a counselor, a coach, a teacher, and an administrator. These are liminal days for all of us, filled with challenge and change. I think at this time we're being invited to explore the gifts of new ways of being. In my caregiving role to pastors and leaders, what has moved me deeply has been the ability of clergy and counselors alike to step forward so eloquently into being present with others through a completely new medium of care providing. I've been touched by the stories of commitment to continue to provide care in the midst of uncertainty and via technology, and the flexibility to gracefully adapt to these changes. A personal example of beautiful caregiving would be the death of a friend during this pandemic. I was grateful for a pastor who courageously supported the family through this complex loss and honored the life through a beautiful graveyard service. And I was also moved by the pastoral presence of friends who surrounded this family remotely as they navigated their grief.
Here we are, a group of people gathered with passionate concerns for binding up wounds and caring for people. But we also are a group of counselors, and our audience is full of those, who are concerned about stepping between where there's injury, of halting abuse, of doing intervention where there is some kind of abusive thing taking place that is hurting people. And so this past 2 weeks has been incredibly painful for us as we watch what's taking place in our nation. And I know all of us would really like to be talking about that. However, we're here because we want to talk about presence and about caring. And our prayer and our hearts, broken as they are with what's been happening in our nation, is also moved by what is needed in our peoplehood, in our communities, in our faith communities, in our circles of believers. So we're going to open with a prayer that epitomizes this. Amy, lead us.
Lord, in your mercy,
Justice,
peace,
Reconciliation,
Transformation,
Peace.
Change.
compassion.
Lord, hear our prayer.
Amen and amen. A moment ago, John talked about the concern for presence and the way in which the use of media can facilitate or can enhance presence. John, would you like to begin by telling us about ways in which you found, or a moment when you found it possible to be genuinely present with people and to invite them to be truly present with you?
Yes, I think the overwhelming way I'm finding to be present is in this area of grief. That there is such a connection for all of us because we share this time of loss. So we think about the large, like the deaths that have been talked about and the illness. But I think there's all these amazing places where people are grieving, and sometimes they simply need us to step in and give them permission to hold that grief and to acknowledge that grief, whether it's a child's graduation or they can't hold a new grandchild. And typically in our faith communities, we would gather and we would hear those stories and understand that, oh, you're feeling the same thing I'm feeling. Like, I feel normal. Now in our isolation, we're not able to share those stories. So I think my ability to be present is simply to give them permission to call that a grief, so that whenever we get through this experience, whenever that is, we don't have a backlog of a lot of grief that we've held in our bodies during this time, that we've been able to process that. And the second thing of that is I'm finding that I'm doing a lot more self-disclosure as a therapist. It's a tool we're taught to use, but use sparingly. And I'm surprised how often I find myself identifying and offering my own stories of that. And I think partly it is because we are disconnected from the people we would normally do that with. And I'm sharing a lot of their same experiences. I'm going through the same thing a lot of people are. And so that sense of telling some of my own stories when it's appropriate is happening more often than it normally would in the normal world.
Who else would like to speak to the issue of presence?
As John just mentioned, presence, when we think about it, reminds us to show up, and we show up in bodies. And one of the really important things to remember as we're thinking about caring for others is that we show up in real bodies. And as we are caring for people's spirits, it's an important reminder for us to help people to stay embodied. Part of my work is as Dean of Students, but I also do spiritual direction. And I start every session with inviting people as they are able and comfortable to pay attention to their body, just to listen. Listen to what your body's saying to you. I'm not trying to change it in that moment just yet, but reminding us that when we invite ourselves to presence, it starts first with us and in our bodies. And even as we are distant, physically distant from one another, being able to remind ourselves of our own embodiedness and how we are spirit ourselves is a very important first step in offering care.
I'll be honest that I had to change pretty drastically some of the ways that I'm present with residents, because we're not allowed to sing. That is one of the ways that we might pass COVID on to one another. And so for 3 months now, I cannot sing. We don't meet in groups for devotions. And even when I'm with residents, I can't sing. And I relied on that as this loving presence of God and a common language that so many of the residents here rely on to feel connected to each other and to God. And so it was very hard to let that tool go. And then we found the iPads. Our IT department gave each chaplain an iPad, and now I ask people what their favorite hymn is, and I go onto YouTube and find their hymn. And so I had to adapt, and I think that's the difference in this era, is being willing to change our toolbox and to adapt for the well-being of our residents.
one of the tenets that is central to my work is the encouragement for people not to be afraid of the dark times in life. This is one of these dark times in a way that is shared more universally than many of us have experienced. And I think I agree with John about we need to acknowledge the many losses and painful realities of this time. And I think we also need to encourage people to consider the space for grateful awareness. When people are invited to reflect on the impact of these days, I'm also hearing stories of real gifts that people have tapped into as they are learning to step out of the flow of the busyness of life and learn to be present to their families and each other amidst the many challenges of sheltering in place, but also many of the gifts that are emerging and the stories I hear about that. I mean, in my work, I see my role as helping people tap into their deepest awareness of what they need to care for themselves, and then to find a way to honor that in their daily life. And this is a time more than ever for that. So my work includes deep listening, encouraging people to reflect honestly on their experiences, and nudging them to reclaim or to discover those ways of being that are central to their wellness and might look a lot different in these days.
As you already know, I'm working in Guatemala now, and Guatemalan people is very emotional and very kind and open to touch each other. And now the social distance is a very distressing thing. And the brokenness about that kind of emotional connection complicates sometimes many things among them or among us, because I'm also Guatemalan. Then one thing we're trying to do is to tell more about our love for each other, express our feelings in our conversation by Zoom or Facebook or in our chat in WhatsApp. And I'm a no savvy person on that, but I'm learning a lot. The issue is our people need to feel that they are not alone. And the presence, the physical presence is important, but at this time, the beautiful presence of the Holy Spirit through our words, in our kindness, when some of them suffer more than others. Then other thing we do besides to talk about loving each other is try to avoid the overemphasis in the problem and talk more about our capacities and our powerful tools, spiritual and human tools, to be together in this. In my case, what I do is try for myself to keep me emotionally safe and offer them a kind of no anxious presence in my pastoral ministry with them. And that helped a lot.
A comment yet on presence. I found by observation through the years that listening and loving are so similar that most people cannot tell the difference. So that when one feels truly heard, one feels embraced and loved. And to find cues on Zoom or on FaceTime to say, I'm listening, tell me more. What did you mean about that? Say more deeply, go further. I'd like to hear. Are ways of saying, I care about you. And Zoom does not inhibit that. FaceTime, Skype, it allows you to listen and draw out. Now, Gilberto, you already moved into our second concern, and that is, how do we become articulate about the presence of God in our midst when it's through the screen? How do we express in loving presence that we know that a greater presence is in our midst? And maybe you'd like to add to that and help us around the circle talk about experiencing the presence of God in our midst, even through the computer?
I think I promised to start with that. And I have just a very, very punctual things here. I start with myself, trying to be clear that I am a person who will be used to share something from God to people. And it's very important for me, some disciplines. I'm a very passionate person, I'm very emotional. But when I try to express what God is trying to do, I prefer to start with myself, putting my own way to be under God. I'm used to say, God, I want to offer myself to you first and put me in peace, an inner peace in an appropriate way that I can use my personal resources and abilities and skills to be instrument for people. Because if you are not with me, what I can do? And I used to read and reread and reread the words in Exodus about God's and Moses talking, when Moses says, if you don't move with me, I will not go. That's the first thing I try to do. Be aware that God is not there in the moment when I sit before my computer to talk with our people, or to do everything that I have to do at this time of stress in Guatemala. Then I say to God, please move to first, and I will try to follow. And obviously, for a person who always is very pushy like me, it's a real complicated to abandon myself. That is the first thing as discipline I'm trying to do. The second thing is that I invite people before worship to do a home literature. And we sent some ideas and permit them in their own home to decide how they will celebrate our Sunday worship at home first. And then they come to connect to our conversation by Zoom and enjoy our time together. And then after that, on Monday, we have a conversation with all to everyone to express how we were capable to see and enjoy the God's presence in this time. And it's very, very enlightening, because I discovered that there is some things that God is doing with them in such a way that I have nothing to do. And it's not about pastoral skill, it's what the Holy Spirit is doing.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's really important to me to remind myself that I do not bring the presence of God to another in any occasion. I go there to discover God there, how God is at work there. Wanda, would you like to carry on?
Sure. I mean, in response to this question, I found myself thinking about a clergy support and consultation group that I facilitate. And this is a group that meets monthly, and we've continued to do this virtually throughout this time. We begin our group with a time of silence and prayer, and then we end in prayer. It's been my privilege to pray for group members, and they've noted how important it is to have someone pray for them when in their roles, they're usually praying for others. Being present to God and each other while meeting virtually is as possible with technology as in person. And if I sound surprised, it's because I am. It's been an interesting discovery. It is very powerful to sit in stillness in the presence of others, whether in the same room or sharing a computer screen. And I think that's a piece that's so important not to lose track of during this time. We have learned that it doesn't work so well to pray in unison as we used to end our time together with the Lord's Prayer. So now I simply conclude the prayer, just one of the small adaptations in this time.
I'm finding that Sunday morning is perhaps becoming even more of a powerful time for people to be connecting to God, because everything's been shuffled and moved around. And so I think perhaps we're all a little bit more alert to the presence of God and these new forms of worship. At Landis Homes, we have a service on Sunday morning. And we continue to have that with no one in the chapel. So it's televised across a closed circuit TV. We have a few musicians that are there standing 6 feet apart, providing music. And then there's a worship leader and a preacher. And what we're finding is that more people on campus are listening to this than ever before, because we encouraged people who live in residential living, keep going to your churches on Sunday morning prior to COVID. And now they're home, they're here at Landis Homes. And so they're doing both. They're tapping into what their pastors and congregations are doing in their congregations, plus they're watching the Landis Homes service. And it's been wonderful to have a greater ecumenical community at Landis Homes worshiping together. And a week or two after Easter, I hosted a Sunday morning service, and we had communion. So we advertised ahead of time to have people get their own juice and crackers or whatever elements they wanted and have it handy. And even in healthcare and personal care, the staff did an amazing job of getting crackers and juice to everyone who wanted it. And it was such a meaningful communion, even though we weren't in the same physical space. We were connected with the Spirit and with closed circuit TV.
My sister at Landis Homes was deeply moved by your chapel where Jim Lapp spoke. So she called me to tell me about it, and I then wrote to Jim Lapp to say, your witness is reaching all the way to California. So you have a wider circle than you would guess. John, where would you begin?
Well, I think with what Wanda was saying about the presence of God in the midst of our silence and in the midst of our pauses and the times when we don't know what to say, it's taken some adjustment on Zoom or Skype or FaceTime to let that lag time happen. But it's just as profound when we become comfortable, when I become comfortable to let that space there. And so clients, individuals who would have chosen to start sessions in silence before they begin to talk about what's important to them, it works the same way. That sense of we're holding this space together, that God is in this space and we are being attentive to it, has the same. In some ways, I'm finding there's a connection that comes through this little box that has less barriers in some ways to connecting to people than when they're in my presence. And it's fascinating to think about. There's almost more trust or self-disclosure sometimes in this avenue than what we get when we have to navigate the physical space. So it's another way that I think God's showing up that I didn't really expect to see.
I try to live Abram Joshua Heschel, the great rabbi's line, in every moment there is the possibility of the sacred, and open my eyes to see it. Every moment has a sacred aspect, if one can only see it. Shannon.
I appreciate the wisdom that has been spoken. I've noticed in many congregations, I spend Sunday mornings hopping from Zoom to Zoom, enjoying many different congregations, and notice an increase in participation. I wonder a lot about how we are finding our spirits and in relationship with God. I think that sometimes we have to start at the place and be honest and say it's harder to find God right now. And our honesty sometimes gets us to some very authentic places. Folks are showing up on Sundays because we need God. We need connection. We need answers. We need hope. we need it now in incredible ways. And there are ways that we are thriving and striving and reaching for that, that we need each other. We need community and church to help sustain. Wanda, you mentioned in your earlier comments about darkness and being honest about being in places of darkness. And sometimes I wonder if we're showing up because we need something new from God right now too. This is a moment we've never seen before, and sometimes our theology doesn't stretch this far. And so we're trying to craft new ways of seeing and understanding God, even in these places of darkness. And care will mean that we pull God into the darkness with us, or find God in the darkness where God already is. There are lots of new emerging conversations about, just as we know enlightenment, there is also endarkment, places where we find God in the darkness and know that there is still presence there with us. And so all of the ways that we can be honest and say that we're reaching for God, for things that we sometimes cannot see, but can continue to trust that God is there wherever we may find ourselves, is a part of what looking for the holy means too.
What you said really speaks to me, Shannon. Thank you. That was really helpful. I remember Gregory of Nyssa, the early desert father, said that when Moses was young, he met God in the light, but as he matured, he met God in the darkness. I wonder often when I see the darkness of thousands of people dying of COVID, whether I'm really totally aware of what it is to meet God in those tragic deaths and suffering. It calls for a new kind of self-care. And we want to talk about self-care. In fact, Wanda, maybe you could start us off in talking about how we care for ourselves in the midst of all of this.
As a therapist throughout my work life, I think tending to self-care has been an absolute necessity. It hasn't been an optional thing. And I think that's equally true for those in pastoral ministry. So I endeavor to do those things that I encourage others to do, and at times do that better than other times. I have a number of specifics that I do to care for myself, but I also believe in what I consider my key underlying considerations, and I'll speak to those. Each of us has at least some awareness of those things that we do to care for ourselves. So these are the things that we claim time for when we're operating from our best selves. So think about those things that have historically made you feel well, grounded, and full of energy. And while we know that it might not be possible to engage each of these in the way we used to, I think the invitation in this time is to think creatively about how we might adapt them. I see this also as an invitation to dig deep this time and to reimagine how to live our lives. So considering making space for meaningful reading or engaging in conversation with others about important subjects, listening to podcasts that inspire you. I mean, essentially giving permission to engage the questions that you would like to ponder. This is truly a time, I think, to consider what we believe, and as Shannon said, maybe reconsider what we believe, to think about that in new ways, and then to root ourselves in this knowing. I think this is a time when we as a faith community can claim, maybe in a new way, in our North American context anyway, the importance of faith and the value that it plays in guiding our lives. So scripture and other spiritual readings can serve as a very rich resource to center us and promote our growth. And lastly, you've heard me refer to stillness already, and I do believe in the value of the encouragement of stillness. Stillness in the form of silence or prayer, or even journaling, meditation, perhaps a long walk by yourself. Stillness allows us to step back from our lives and listen deeply. And this is something that our society in general doesn't seem to encourage. So these days are really inviting us to interrupt the momentum of our lives, to create a gap in the flow of all the detail. And in doing this, we may bring our attention to what beckons us or invites our further thought, and we need only to listen.
I remember almost 30 years ago when I was in bed here in California at 4 in the morning or 3 in the morning, and the phone by the bed rang, and I woke and groggily picked it up, and it said, "David, this is Mark. I got to talk." It was Marcus Smooker. He and I had a covenant that we could call each other at 2 in the morning and never need to apologize. You got to have somebody like that in your life. And if you're carrying on pastoral care right now and you don't have a covenant with 1 or 2 people that you really trust, that you can call at any time and talk, and let your heart really pour out and let them pour out their heart to you. Don't go solo. Don't go alone. John, where would you?
Yeah, self-care is something we as therapists are good at teaching and preaching, and sometimes not so good at practicing. But I'm aware this time is simply requires more energy of me. Maybe it's because I'm aging, but I think there's also this reality that our brain is having a harder time just making small decisions. During this time, we find it hard, and I hear this from a lot of people. I just can't decide what to do, what to wear, where to go, like, should I do this or not? And that just takes a lot more energy to sort through our days. So initially my caseload dropped quite a bit because a lot of people didn't want to do this. And so I had all this time on my hand, and so I thought I have all these projects I'll do outside, and the week before this hit, I hurt my back, and so actually I've been laying on my back a lot. I've been reading a lot. I've been doing a lot of really good self-care things, not because I've wanted to, but because I was sort of invited into that space. But in the midst of that, things are showing up that would not show up if I had gone and done all these projects. And so it's really kind of given me even more physical, emotional, spiritual permission to invite other people into that space. So the things that I do, I take photos, I write haikus, I bike, I garden. My garden's bigger and more lush than it's ever been. And the other thing that I struggle with is I've reduced the amount of people I can see in a week. And that doesn't feel good, because part of me feels like I should be stepping up and working harder during this time of crisis. But I'm aware that what it's taken to keep me in the space where I'm helpful to people is requiring more of my own attention and my own care, my own prayer, whatever we call that. So yeah, it's a really kind of a challenging space with some of my values that I feel in tension of.
Who's next?
I'm going to jump in and just say, it looks like Gilberto has something to say. Hang on just a second, Gilberto.
Okay.
We are taking your questions, and no one has yet posed a question. We will turn to questions in a few minutes. So if something has emerged here that you want a panelist to go a little deeper on or unpack from your context, please feel free to share a question here with our panel today. Go ahead, Gilberto.
Okay. I agree with all the panelists in what it already says. Then I will not repeat that. I will add something for a personal level. The first thing, I try to keep safe my good sense of humor. I try to enjoy myself and see in many things around me something delightful and enjoyable. This is one thing. The other thing, what I try to do, and I used to do for almost all my life and ministry, is to have 6 or 7 people praying for me every single day. I invite people from my congregation, and we agree to assign one of them one day to pray for me. And then at the end of the week, I pray for all of them. That way, I feel that I have somebody behind me backing my spiritual awareness and health. The other thing is that I have 3 friends that are able to talk with me without any ceremony. about my weakness, about my failures, and about what I need to improve. And they do very well. And sometimes they offend me and are very aggressive with me. Not because they want to be aggressive, it's because it's the feeling that creates in me or search from me when I feel that they are right and I don't want to change. When I resist, they push me a lot. The other thing that helped me a lot is listen my wife criticizing my work. That's very good to keep me safe. She helped me to see things that I can't see for myself. Then, in a personal, internal way, I wrote something here to don't forget. If I want to listen others, I have to learn to listen myself. Then I have a crazy moment to talk loudly with myself. Sometimes I write down, but many times I choose tell myself, what are you doing? And I will finish with what happened when I do this. In this week, in these 2 weeks, these 2 last weeks, I was considering what happened in U.S. With these all distressing things and painful situation in U.S. and what happened the last week in Guatemala, in the northern part of Guatemala, a Mayans, almost Mayan priest was killed. The community burned him in public and enjoyed that. I have relationship with some people from universities and in other areas that are connected with what he was doing, investigating and investing time to create awareness about the traditional medicine from Mayan background. And some religious people accuse him to be a kind of a demon in the community, an evil man. And some people kill him, pouring gasoline on him and applauding his death. And the first thing that I feel is something that happened to me just one time in my life in the 80s, when we live here in the midst of a lot of violence and a lot of horrible things in a social turmoil. And when I was visiting a community after a church of 30 people was killed in a grotesque way, when I saw the pastor laying in congregation, I was very familiar with that congregation. I was leading the Mennonite church in Guatemala at the time. I feel a kind of different pain, and I feel for the first time in my life a kind of hate, a feeling of hate, and I was scared about my feeling because I'm a man of peace. And I feel that it was a moment to say, oh, come on, what we can do? Just stop. And I came back to my home sick. And I get into a time of 1 or 2 weeks to keep myself without people around me, just crying and suffering for my feelings. 2 days ago, I talked with my congregation about what happened in U.S. and with that priest, Mayan priest, wise man, they say, abuelo wise man. And I told my congregation, I feel sad, deeply sad about this. And then how we can keep in a healthy condition, in a healthy soul, when it's the concrete conditions in life, in the context that challenges pastoral ministry. It's not that kind of a ideological or philosophical issue about how to keep healthy. It's a concrete context that show you the rough thing in life. Then I remember that moment in the jungle when I was feeling hate, and I'm a person of peace. Then I transform not only my confession, but my approach to this. And I talk with my congregation and say, I'm sad. I'm horrible, terrible, deeply sad. And I need help. What I'm trying to say is pastors tend to avoid to confess when they are in a weak situation or vulnerable situation, emotionally or in life. I read in some places that 90% of our failures came from loneliness and absence of enough courage to say when we are passing for fears, anxiety, or anguish. Then my suggestion in this conversation is never be with the arrogance, close the door. Be capable to open the door.
You've led us through the valley.
Go ahead.
You've led us through the valley of the shadow of death here, and we really appreciate it, Gilberto. That was marvelous. We need to turn now to the questions that are being raised, and so Amy,
I think Gilberto sort of sets us up here from a question that's come from Carol, who is joining us, that when we first set up this webinar, and David, you referenced it too, we were talking about pastoral care and counseling amid a health pandemic. But now, in the last few weeks, we are also here in the US and in Canada and around the world undergoing a racial justice revolution. And I think holding those two together is something that many pastors are trying to do right now. Talk a little bit about that. What recommendations do you have for pastors as they try and help people with these two really huge things right now that we're all working to process?
I think as you framed the question, Amy, and talking about two different things, I think one of the things we can help ourselves imagine is we're talking about wellness.
Yes.
And wellness is both about care and it's about justice. I cannot be well if there is not justice in my world. And so these are not disconnected things. Our ability to offer care with people, for people is wrapped up in our works of justice, both individually and systemically. And so it is all in the same conversation, the same ways that we do our ministry, and not disconnected from each other.
For us in California, it's the reality that the deaths among minority groups are double what they are among the dominant cultural group. So the injustice is evident in the pandemic, that is also evident in the other aspects of our life. And Shannon's cry for justice has got to be central to our cries, that change comes to all of this. We're others.
Yes, and as a chaplain, one of my roles is to preach and to teach, and the Gospels are full of stories in which Jesus is all about justice and widening the circle. And so I feel like my voice is getting stronger right now as I read scripture and tell stories and appeal to people to think differently. And yes, we all need to get our news. We need to be informed. We need to learn. And we have the gospel that can shape us and change us, and we can be transformed. So I feel empowered right now to say things that I probably wouldn't have 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I'm grateful to be called out as a pastor, as a chaplain, to say more and do more, and to find strength in Jesus Christ to be transformed.
I want to add something here. I think this is also a problem of a theological approach to this. Churches have to change. And the way churches are doing things in US, I lived there for 25 years working with Mennonite Church, are two kind of isolated congregations from the context. And also, we have to avoid the token idea. That we will do something as a token that we are aware, or as a token that we understand. It's a matter of something more deeper in our DNA as Church of Christ, which is we are for the people and we exist. The church only have two reasons to be in the world, is because God loves the world. And we need to be in connection with that in our local areas. Mm-hmm. It's time to be more multicultural in the sense of our understanding of our local congregations. We have to be more also aware that we need to release the passion, ministry for passion in our local congregations in different way. We Mennonites are over engineering and a way to organize things. In a way, people cannot be in the possibility to express or probability to express all their potential, because there is a lot of kind of maze understanding about ecclesiology in our practice. Then my suggestion is we need to change our approach, what's meant to be church, after all these things that are happening right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take one more quick question here. We have a question from Craig noting that he's a pastor who's trying to offer pastoral care in the midst of all these regular responsibilities that are now online and heightening kinds of things. And most of our congregations in Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA have fewer than 100 people on Sunday morning. Pastors are scrambling. That is something we certainly continue to hear. Leave us with one closing thought, one quick idea of something you have, a pro tip, so to speak, of something for pastors at this time in the midst of trying to provide care while preaching and carrying on. What's your one takeaway you want to make sure someone carries with them today?
I would say the ability to acknowledge that we are inadequate. You mean this pandemic and this racial justice piece that have come together, and we find ourselves trying to approach that and address that. Not to stop at that point, but I don't think we'll find other options until we can stop and say, I don't feel adequate to do this. And in that place, God's presence has the ability to show up. But I think we have to somehow say, at this point in time, what I'm offering does not feel adequate or right.
I suggest, sorry.
I would simply add with John's statement of recognizing our inadequacy to immediately release the shame that comes along with that idea.
Yeah.
The shame and the shoulds become burdens. Sometimes even hearing the word self-care gives me a certain kind of feeling of resistance. Do the things that allow us to be free right now without holding that against ourselves. Sometimes we just can't do more. And that's okay.
I'm sure that in pastoral ministry is complicated because many things that are not connected with real what means to be church. It's because in the way we want to do things, in sometimes the excessive intention to control outcomes affect pastor. The way leaders in the church try to control the outcomes in the church affect pastoral ministry. Then I'm doing something, and I suggest that maybe some others can do that. I started since March when we in Guatemala became completely disconnected. And because my age, I cannot go too often to the streets, because for my age, I don't know if I'm a danger for others, or really others are a danger for me. But the issue is that I have to keep myself at home. But the point is, I started doing a list of things that I'm learning as pastor for this time. And my list is growing and growing and growing. Then it's liberating for me, because I discovered that I'm really a good observer about what I have no idea what it is. Then learn, learn, and learn.
That's a good practice.
I would say pay attention to the ratio of giving and receiving. And when I find myself tearing up more than normal, I know that I've probably met my quotient of caring about the world's problems or individuals' problems and sadnesses. And so stepping back and taking care of myself, or allowing others to care for me, so just pay attention.
I would say that this is a time to relook at how we do church and what are the things that really matter. And if relationships are at the core, how do we free, and maybe this is more a message to congregations than pastors, but how do we free pastors to spend their time where it really matters right now in terms of tending people's souls and well-being, and maybe remove some of the obligations and busy work that could be set aside at such a time as this. The only other thing I'd say in terms of the last few weeks and our world's being rocked again is that I think we also need to listen to the young people in our churches, because they're stepping forward with a wisdom that I know I need to hear at my age and stage, and I think they're going to be the church of the future and will lead the way.
Thank you so much to each of you as panelists for giving this time today, for thinking through the questions. Thank you so much, David, for coordinating the questions and helping give shape to this conversation. All of us really appreciate your time and your insights, and I know that we are all leaving with some fresh ideas for how we care for ourselves and one another in this new time of physical distancing. I want to thank you as well to everyone who's joined us on the screen today. Again, this webinar has been recorded, and we will post the link to our MennoMedia Facebook page and our YouTube channel later this week. Two more quick announcements. One, MennoMedia is a nonprofit organization, and we rely both on sales of our products and donations to continue our ministry. So if you have found the content of these adaptive church webinars to be valuable, we do invite you to consider making a donation to MennoMedia. A link is being posted in the chat from our IT team. As I said in the beginning, we are working on a special edition of Leader Magazine, focusing just on COVID-19 and the congregation. Normally, Leader comes out 4 times a year and it is mailed to you. This will be a 5th issue of Leader, and it will be available just online digitally. And it is free for everyone. You don't have to be a Leader subscriber to get it. It will be available by July 1. So watch for that. Everyone here who has joined us today will be receiving a link to that when it's available. So we invite you all to be reading that as well. Finally, when you registered today, we asked you about your interest in other possible webinar topics. And I'm happy to say that we are actually going a slightly different direction than some of those topics. We are planning on a webinar that will speak to racism and addresses the moment of significant change that we are in right now in society. The webinar will be focused on helping pastors and congregations be part of this change. So look for more information on a date and time for that soon in your inbox. Until next time, I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.